There's something about being forced to read a book for a class that can really just kill the joy of it. Even if it's a book you might enjoy on your own, the sense of obligation just makes us want to do it less. So I thought it would be fun for me to break down my favorite books that I read for class during high school and see which ones managed to stick with me years later. And drop me a comment what your favorite book from school was if you have one, because I'm curious which ones kind of stuck for other people the way that these 6 or 7 did for me. Before we get into the list, I have one honorable mention, and that is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. We all know the basics of this story, so I was pretty excited to read it in my freshman year of high school, and it did not disappoint. With the gothic era of London it's set in and like the creepy, paranormal, mad science-y aspect of the plot, this book is like a tense thriller that doesn't terrify you too much, and then it's also a book about a man's struggle for control of his impulses and his body, which are both kind of perfect for like a high school reader. It's a solid and like super accessible metaphor about our own self-control and like negative urges, and this one definitely stuck in my mind as like a really fun read. That 9th grade class was also a huge influence in opening me up to enjoy books more, so shout out to Mr. Burke. Without him, this channel and these videos may not exist. Moving into the list itself, at number 6, I have The Crucible, the play by Arthur Miller about the Salem witch trials. I read this sophomore year, and it's an interesting memory because our teacher had us choose characters, and we'd basically in class do like a table read of every scene, or most scenes. And I was Reverend Hale, pretty main character. I love period pieces, so I was really into this from the start, but it turned out to be like an awesome story about injustice, the court of public opinion, and like individual resilience. I'm gonna try to be vague, but that scene with Giles Corey where he says more weight, like, that's so tough. It's so tough. At the time, people talked about being a little bored by this one, but I thought the character dynamics were so strong, and like the drama, the intrigue, and the religion versus morality kind of struggle all kept me wanting more. Next up at number 5, I have The Stranger by Albert Camus. Can we stand it up? Can we? This is probably one of the deeper books on the list, but since I was 16 when I read it, I definitely wasn't as appreciative of like the philosophy as I would be now. For anyone who doesn't know, this book is a first-person account by a Frenchman of the events leading up to and following his murder of an Arab man in Algeria. And this is another one where vivid details aren't really coming back to me, but something about just the summer haze and like the golden beaches of Algiers combined with the narrator's like indifference and almost lack of humanity was just really intriguing to me at the time. It reminds me now of The Moviegoer by Walker Percy, which I read last year, so it's cool that I still kind of have an appreciation for those kind of like numb, tormented protagonists. And then Camus is also an author who I want to dive into now as an adult and kind of appreciate that philosophical style more, so I have my lit teacher to thank for my first exposure to him. Up to number 4 on the list, it's the book that I think has maybe like the highest approval rating out of all the ones that high schoolers are forced to read, and that is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Roaring Twenties are just such a chaotic time. I mean, it's lavish, it's beautifully written, it's like a little bit noir, like it's got all the pieces to entertain, I think, people of a bunch of different ages. I actually got this book last year for my little cousin who's in high school because I think it's such a good formative read, and I think it shows you that like older books that have some figurative language can still be really entertaining. Plus that final line is so iconic. Number 3 on the list is a different pick both in subject matter and format, and that's the graphic novel Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. I read this all the way back in my freshman year of high school in a history class because we were studying the Middle East, and even then I could just like feel how powerful it was. It's based on the author's real life growing up in Iran in the 80s during like the fall of the Shah's regime and the Islamic Revolution, and the black and white like art style she uses combined with the subject matter is just such a strong storytelling device. This book had such a hold on me when we were reading it, and I think it's such a smart book for a history teacher to show to kids because number 1, it's a graphic novel, which they're definitely going to be more willing to read, and number 2, it makes history personal. Like, you're not reading, in 1980, the government did this. It's like that thing that the government did in 1980 changed this girl's life forever. Again, I've forgotten a lot of the plot details of Persepolis since it was, almost 10 years ago now that I read it, but that power and that sense of history coming alive will probably never go away, and that's why it's so high on this list. Number 2 here, I'm expecting to be pretty controversial, and it is Moby Dick or the Whale by Herman Melville. I feel like this is the stereotypical big, dense, boring book that people read in high school, and so I totally get why someone would not have fun with this, especially when they're being forced to read it in the first place. That being said, I love whales. They've been my favorite animal for almost as long as I can remember. Here's me at 12 years old with a beluga whale. I mean, come on, man, look at this kid. What happened to him? And I've been to the New Bedford Whaling Museum a number of times in the same city where the book starts, so Moby Dick felt specifically tailored to me. Again, if you're not familiar with the plot, our narrator Ishmael is a sailor who gets work on a whaling ship that's led by the crazy Captain Ahab, and Ahab is totally consumed by his quest for revenge against the white whale Moby Dick, who bit off his leg during a previous voyage. This book is for sure dense, and there are chapters that are just like measurements about the ship or like facts about whales, but the huge scale of the man versus nature story and like battling our own demons really had my attention, and also loving whales and the ocean just made it much more interesting as a plotline. It's got stuff to say about human arrogance and impotence when we're dealing with like an unknown world, and I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but Moby Dick is a book that I will always treasure. And finally, number one, based purely off of memory, and my copy of this book is super beat up, but it is Animal Farm by George Orwell. I read this in history class, actually, my sophomore year when we were doing a unit about Soviet communism, and I think this is the book that taught me the power of allegory. For anyone who hasn't read it, this book's like a really sharp metaphor about the rise of Stalinist... Come on, dog. About the rise of Stalinist communism told through animals in a barnyard, and it sounds bonkers insane, but it really, really works. To a 15-year-old, symbolism on this scale was like mind-blowing stuff. I was like, but he, and And I think the reason this takes a top spot for me was this book was what made it click for the first time that fiction can sometimes give you a message about the real world in a much more immediate and more memorable way than nonfiction about the same topic. And that's the list. These are the books that impacted me the most in high school. If I were to reread these books and do the list over again, there might be a little movement. I think, honestly, Moby Dick might hop up to number one, but I think almost all of these would at least still be in the list. I hope everyone's taking it easy and reading a lot during the snow that we're having right now in Massachusetts. I'm almost done with The Way of Kings. So close. We're getting there. As always, I appreciate you. Keep having fun and working towards your goals, and I'll see you next week.